I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21, and I'd like to welcome you to this programme today. This is one of several programmes we've done in a sort of series that we've titled Democracy Focus, where we've interviewed decision makers online and let people come on and ask live questions. And today we're really pleased to have Peter Hain MP join us for this Democracy Live programme, and he will be answering questions and taking part.
Hello, I'm Andrea Gordon. Now, Peter did a House of Commons meeting with us a few weeks ago, and in it he raised some doubts about the health of our democracy. In this programme we plan to question him further and to get his ideas of how to more effectively engage people. This is a programme where you at home, or wherever you are, the audience, can tune in and also send in your comments and your questions through the computer and also watch the programme at the same time. If you want to tweet us, then please do so at #DemocracyGN21. That's #DemocracyGN21. But please, for the duration of this programme, send your comments and your questions through the Internet TV platform.
In this programme we will have a general viewing audience. We'll also have a GlobalNet 21 audience, and we're pleased as well that we will have an audience of students from Christchurch University in Canterbury. These are students studying international relations and politics. Now, not only are they joining us today in this programme, but they've actually recorded some video inserts, comments and questions that we're going to play into the programme and put to Peter. So you'll be able to hear those later. But please, can you also add your questions, write them in a little box below the video screen. Start sending in your questions now, because later on we will be taking those questions live. Anyhow, before we start, I thought it's important to ask Peter one question because of the events that happened last week. In Paris, we saw some horrific events last week that take place, but we also saw a remarkable demonstration on the Sunday, where we saw communities coming together, trying almost on the day forge a new dialogue between communities. Peter, how much do you think what happened in Paris, both the tragic events and that remarkable march, how much do you think that will have an effect on us all as we rethink both democracy and the way communities live together?
Well, can I first of all thank you for inviting everybody. It's a pleasure and a privilege to have this dialogue with you. The terrible
a little trouble with my setup here. Are you?
On Paris last week and the response to it. I mean, the actual attack, I think, horrified everybody except an infinitesimally small minority.
Okay.
And we saw that in the huge march in Paris itself on Sunday, attended by a lot of international leaders and presidents and prime ministers and so on, and the reaction from our own community here in Britain. For my part, I think it's essential that we in Britain make it absolutely crystal clear that we will not tolerate Islamophobia or anti-Semitism or racism of any kind, nor the racist and fascist groups that spread their poison, like the British National Party, the English Defence League, and their various Nazi-like derivatives. It's really, really important at this moment that we say we stand for freedom and democracy and the right of free speech, whether we approve or we disapprove of the cartoons in Charlie Hebdo. It's essential that we stand for those principles, and we are absolutely uncompromising about them.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Andrea?
Yes, well, the dreadful incidents in Paris obviously brought to the forefront the need for creating a conversation around free speech and democracy, and also to define democracy. What does that mean anymore in our modern day societies? In the House of Commons meeting that Peter hosted, one of the criticisms was that this was never really approached, never really dealt with, and that it was rather piecemeal rather than fundamental. Helen Lang was one member who attended the meeting, and she was concerned that nobody on the platform there dealt with what she would call the systemic fault lines of our democracy. Let's have a listen to what Helen Lang has to say.
Yeah, I think there was a broad acknowledgement, I think, from everyone in the room, MPs included, that there are some endemic problems within the system politically around engagement. And I think what I wanted to put as a question is really, if we do feel that there is a systemic failure in the system in engaging the public and politicians effectively doing that, what are they doing as a collective to address that? There seems to be a lot of isolated work going on, but I have seen very little sort of movement towards anyone collectively trying to address this issue.
So Helen was saying, Peter, that at that meeting where we dealt with a lot of points, and I know you had to go early because you had another meeting, which was important, but no one dealt with fundamental systemic issues. They didn't deal with how citizens could be more involved, how they could balance the corporate and the establishment powers there are. I mean, do you have any comment on that?
Well, it's a critical question, Helen, and it's fundamental to whether our democracy thrives or dies. And I think we're at that serious a point. And if you look at the decline in voter turnout since its high point after the Second World War in 1951 of 97%, where virtually everybody voted for the two major parties, the two parties have actually collapsed to under 2/3 now of the electorate supporting them, both in the last election and in the latest polls. And accompanying that has been a long-term, repeated decline over these decades since the early 1950s of the turnout. So governments are being elected on a minority of the electorate, and that's the registered electorate. And the registered electorate is getting increasingly smaller because of individual registration, which means that you've got to individually register rather than somebody in the household doing it for you. You're finding a lot of students, young people, poor people, ethnic minorities simply left out of the opportunity to vote in this so-called democracy of ours. So it is a very systemic crisis. And I don't think that the political class, of which I'm a member, and the Westminster bubble, unfortunately, with the media, which I'm a member of as well, have really, I don't think they really get it. I think the gap between the average citizen and the Westminster bubble is very, very serious, and it's widening all the time.
Yes, indeed. So we all tend to think of this as a UK problem only, but one person again at our House of Commons meeting made it very clear that this is a much wider spread issue, that we have a crisis of democracy across Europe and indeed globally. Arianna De Mario formed an organisation, Citizens for Europe, to campaign to reform the European Union so that it is more democratic. Let's have a listen to what Arianna had to say.
I think a progressive lack of trust in institutions is a growing disinterest in traditional politics is a European phenomenon. It has actually been going on for many years now, but the economic crisis made it stronger all over Europe. Anyway, disillusion in traditional politics doesn't mean disinterest in politics in general, but rather the belief that the classic a left-right dichotomy, and thus the historic parties are not fit to respond to the broad and global challenges of 21st century, which cannot be addressed at the national level anymore, clearly. And so in many countries, participation in the democratic process is just changing form and doesn't mean anymore to join a traditional party or to vote. In some, it is in the form of right-wing movement and parties. In some, in the form of anti-European parties that declare themselves out of the left-right spectrum. In some, it is in the form of citizens' movements. Unfortunately, what many of these new political movements have in common in many EU countries is the use of populism to get votes, and unfortunately, they are succeeding.
So Arianna says that basically this is not just a UK problem, it's a problem right across Europe, and in fact it has global impact. She's saying that right across Europe, globally too, in the United States, there's a lack of trust in politicians. The political party system is no longer fit for purpose. Is that something you could identify with?
Yes, and Arianna's right. It's happening right across the European Union, the United States of America, President Obama managed to buck that trend a bit with his dynamic campaigns, which mobilized whole layers of people that had never been involved before or voted before. But basically, this is a phenomenon of advanced industrial democracies. And ours in Britain is one, and so are the European ones. What is interesting about Europe is that the reaction is taking different forms. So you have, for example, in Greece, Syriza, which is a left-wing party, very well placed, according to the polls, to win the imminent Greek elections. You then got Podemos in Spain, which is a kind of popular progressive party, but much less defined ideologically than Syriza is in Greece, which has also come out of nowhere and is leading in the polls. You've got UKIP in Britain, which isn't leading in the polls, but did beat everybody in the European elections last year. You've got the Front National in France, a racist with quasi-fascist connotations party. And you've got right-wing movements in Germany, very troubling for historic reasons, obviously, and in Scandinavian countries as well. So, I mean, this is a broad phenomenon, and I think the answer to it from the political parties is to start to responding to people, and that goes for the European Union as well. And I'm a very firm and strong pro-European. I think Britain's place in Europe is right at the centre of the pitch, playing with our fellow Europeans, not going onto the spectator stands or walking out of the stadium, as UKIP want us to do, for instance. But that means the political establishment has got to start listening, they've got to start responding. And what is particularly troubling about our own situation, I suspect this is true throughout Europe as well, and I know it's true in America. If you look at the polling data, the last election, people voting were overwhelmingly older, a higher proportion of pensioners voted than young people voted, and a higher proportion of middle-class professional, comfortably off people voted than poorer people voted. So you're getting parties having to tack to the centre to appeal to an increasingly narrow section of the population, which itself is distancing themselves from the majority of the electorate. So these are all troubling trends, and it's part of this deterioration in democracy, and it won't be reversed until the political parties, my own included, are able to respond much better to the electorate.
Okay, of course 2015 marks the 800th anniversary of the signing of the Magna Carta, which first put limitations on the power of the monarchy and is celebrated today as the basis of the British Constitution. Amazingly, this still remains an unwritten constitution, and it changes and evolves as circumstances dictate. However, some people feel today that this provides inadequate protection for their citizens' rights, that government and economic corporations have too much power, and they are wanting to have a written constitution to protect those rights. I wonder, Peter, what are your thoughts on Britain having a written constitution now?
Well, I've always been slightly sceptical about this. I mean, we've got a Human Rights Act. It itself is under attack from people on the right of British politics, including many conservatives. I'm not opposed to a written constitution, but I think it's, given the way our unwritten constitution has developed and our systems of democracy have developed, it's actually going to be incredibly complicated to have one. And it also does give much more power to judges, to the courts, to the judiciary to determine when issues, rather than for Parliament to determine issues. So I would, I'm open to a written constitution, and I think Britain needs to evolve into what we've become, sort of by a process of almost informal process rather than a recognised one, which is formalised constitutionally, to become a more federal system, especially with the additional powers going to Scotland, with Wales getting more powers as well, and Northern Ireland getting, for example, control over its own corporation tax. We're seeing an evolution of Britain constitutionally, in which actually my skepticism in the past about a written constitution may well be superseded by the need to make more specific through legislation the relationship of what Britain is now, which is an increasingly federalized structure. And that means for me too, by the way, which I think will help address the gap between the voters and the system, actually dealing with the English question, and not just Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, beyond London. Londoners, through their assembly and their elected mayor, have quite a lot of power devolved, but the English regions are run in the most centralized way by Whitehall and government departments there than almost any other advanced democracy in Europe.
Well, when we talked to some of the students and staff in Christchurch, that's one of the issues they raised, the idea of a written constitution. And maybe we can listen first of all to what one of the students said of that in relation to the Supreme Court. Let's listen to that now.
My name is Ben. The Supreme Court was set up under Labour. However, the Supreme Court is more effective in countries with a codified written constitution. Can the Supreme Court ever be effective in the UK, given that we do not have a written constitution?
And
Well, Ben, I think...
Just going to go.
Sorry?
I was going to say, Mark Bannister. Are we going to go to Mark Bannister?
Yeah, we'll go to Mark. We'll listen
Yes.
to the staff member first and then ask you a question to both of them.
So yes, Mark Bannister, who teaches at Christchurch University, made this point more strongly, suggesting that we should codify the relationship between central government and its localities and citizens. This is what Mark had to say. We hope.
We hope.
Yeah, it's a very interesting year this year. Not only have we got a general election in May, but of course it's 800 years since Magna Carta. So we're thinking very hard about constitutional change, and the Political and Constitutional Reform Select Committee published a really interesting report last year looking at codification of the Constitution. What are the strengths and weaknesses of actually moving towards a more codified Constitution? This has the potential to really engage the public in looking at the arrangements between the centre and the periphery, looking at the arrangements between citizens and those that govern, and to really change and improve and think carefully about those relationships. Of course, this has many downsides as well. And the Labour Party is currently committed towards a constitutional convention if they win the next election, which will consider a lot of these issues, including House of Lords reform, the devolved institutions, and so on.
Well, I mean, I think some of the points that were being made when we spoke to students, and what have been points that have been made since then, is that yes, and I think you said it in your answer previously, when you have an unwritten constitution, it can evolve, it's organic. But some people argue that when you have a constitution like we used to have, there were lots of checks and balances. There was a free press. Some people will say it's no longer a free press. It's owned by corporate magnates. There was strong local government. Some people will say there's no longer any strong local government. We have central administration administered locally. So the checks and balances to protect citizens' rights are not there. We need something codified, and I think that was the argument.
And that's a very strong argument, along with the case that I put earlier about the need to formalize an informal devolution to certain parts of the United Kingdom, but not to others. And that's to say, not to anywhere outside London. And your point, Francis, about local government. In local governments, especially after the cuts, and I'm not making a party point here, I'm simply describing factually what's happening, especially after pretty savage cuts in local councils' budgets, and depending on who wins the next election, savage cuts to come have been promised by the Conservative Party. and all parties are going to have to rein in public spending to deal with the problems that we inherited from the banking crisis. If local government is effectively decimated in its ability to provide services outside core statutory ones like schooling and social services, which consume the overwhelming amount of the budget, then the gap between the citizen and democracy is going to grow even bigger. Because it's very often, whether your waste is taken away and efficiently your dustbins are cleared, whether your road has got potholes in it or not, whether your local park is clean, whether your streets are safe and clean. It's those issues close to people's homes that matter considerably to them compared with some of the issues that concern me as a national political representative. And so I'm very, very worried indeed about the dismantling of local governments through these very, very severe cuts, with more, depending on who wins the election, to come. I think it's very serious for democracy.
Okay. The reason why people are arguing for a written constitution and a constitutional convention that is citizen-led is that the checks and balances that used to be in place on power, i.e. the press, no longer seem to work. The press once was a champion of freedom and now is often owned by big corporations, which are often part of the establishment. And so there is no one that calls the government to account. We spoke to someone about the role of the press, one of our students from Christchurch. Let's just listen to what he has to say.
Before we did that, we actually spoke to John Fitzgibbon, who actually talked about the Constitutional Convention. And that's something I know it's in Labour Party's policy. So maybe if we could listen to that one first.
Yeah, the Irish government that came into being in 2011 promised major constitutional reform in Ireland, but how do you go about doing that? So in Ireland came up with the idea of hosting a constitutional convention. So what does that mean? So that was basically a convention where 33 elected members of the Irish Parliament got together with 66 ordinary members of the public, drawn at random from the population, but giving a representative sample of old, young, rural, urban, highly educated, working class, middle class, upper class, male, female, and the rest of it. So they debated big, important topics about changes to our constitution, allowing same-sex marriage, votes at 16, removing blasphemy from the constitution, big, important issues like that. So I was involved in that. I was helping out produce materials and to facilitate debate between the participants. All in all, I think it was quite a success in that the Constitution performed quite well. It debated all the issues in a very mature and reasoned fashion, and coming in April, I think, of 2015, we're going to have a referendum in Ireland on same-sex marriage, come about specifically because of the work of the Constitutional Convention. So that type of participatory democracy where you think deeply about what you want for your country, about citizens and politicians getting together and thinking in a long-term fashion about the direction they want for the country, can work quite well. The website constitution.ie has really good materials, a really good background on that if you want to read further about it.
And could that work in the UK?
I think it could work in the UK. I think it would work particularly well in the UK because the politics in the UK can be quite divisive. So if you create an environment whereby it's non-partisan, where you get members from different political parties and ordinary citizens, and they sit around all together and they discuss big, important issues, long-term, no-party issues, anything like that, I think it could work quite well. It's better than the situation we have now. Why not try it?
I mean, what was interesting about John Fitzgibbon's comments was the way he talked about the Constitutional Convention. I mean, I know it's Labour Party policy, and I don't know whether the Labour Party's given any deep thought to it or whether you have. But what John is saying is that the Constitutional Convention is not just the establishment, it's not just, you know, the elites, it is also citizen-led. You know, if you're going to talk about local government, for example, you can say there are lots of cuts, but even under Labour, 60–70% of the funding came from central government, whereas in Sweden it's the other way round. How do you involve citizens? How do you get them engaged in this? I mean, in a constitutional convention, have you given any thought to how we can make it as much citizen-led as establishment-led?
That's very difficult. I mean, it would be great if it was citizen-led in the real sense of the term, but in practice it tends to be those citizens who are in the minority who participate in politics of one form or another, or involved in civic life, the churches and so on, trade unions and so on. So I don't think we should exaggerate the extent to which a constitutional convention will truly involve everybody, though it is Ed Miliband's objective to involve people to the maximum possible extent. And he's said, and therefore to become Labour policy, that, and I think it's the right thing, that those questions I was raising earlier about Britain's future in terms of federal structure, more devolution to England and so on, those should be determined not by the Westminster elite, but by a much broader section of civic society. And one of the issues that has to be dealt with in that is reform of the House of Lords, in my view. I mean, it's completely anachronistic that we have a second chamber still with 90 hereditary peers in it, are only there because their great grandmother slept with a king or some member of the royal family. And they've inherited that privilege to vote on our laws. And then, of course, the majority now are determined by patronage, by appointments by the party leaderships. And so, I mean, we need, in my view, a 100% elected House of Lords, or Senate, as it probably will evolve to be called, or at least the vast majority elected with an element of appointees. And that would also enable a more representative section of the regions of England and of the nations of the United Kingdom to send representatives, if it's done by proportional representation on a list system like the European votes are at the present time. So Wales, for example, would get, let's say, I don't know, 25 peers or whatever the number was, and then it would be replicated proportionately to the population around the UK. The West Midlands would get its set number of senators, London similarly, the northeast of England, Cornwall and so on. Now, I think that would make for a much more democratic parliament, because the second chamber, on its existing powers that the House of Lords has, would be able to act as a kind of a more representative check on House of Commons and MPs like myself than the House of Lords can possibly claim to be, being a mixture of hereditaries and majority appointees.
Okay, just before we go on to the next question, let me remind everyone, please send in your questions live. Some of them are coming in now and we'll be coming to them shortly. So type your questions in now and we'll put them to Peter in a couple of minutes. One of the other issues is the issue of a press in a democracy, a free press. I mean, some people argue we don't have a free press any longer in the way that we would like to have a free press. But we spoke to one of the students in Christchurch and he made a comment on the press that you might like to sort of respond to. Let's listen to what he said now.
Hi, my name is Sean Jones and my question's about press freedom. Given in light of the recent shooting in Paris in which 12 journalists, I believe, were killed, and there's how there is limited press freedom in other nations, other non-Western nations such as China and Russia, to name a few. In light of the phone hacking scandal, the Leveson inquiry, which hasn't been enacted to set limitations on certain press activity, do you believe that the limitations set by the Leveson inquiry impede too greatly on press freedom?
I don't actually. I think that the Leveson inquiry got it about right, which is about protecting victims of misrepresentation in the press, ordinary citizens. It was actually not about the draconian controls on editorial freedom, which I wouldn't have supported. I think they got it about right. I just observe, I think the observation that we have a media dominated by 3 or 4 at most very powerful individuals through their own corporations it's very troubling. And there are some newspapers, The Guardian perhaps the most notable, that exposed the phone hacking, that exposed and ran the Snowden leaks on the extent of surveillance that is taking place and so on all of us. That was journalism and newspapers at its best. And so we do have a British newspaper which is world class in a way for its fight for liberty and press freedom. The other point I'd make, which is perhaps not actually central to people's thoughts necessarily, but I'll give you my views for what that's worth, is I think the way the media are covering politics at the present time and the way politicians interact with the media in the Westminster bubble, and there's the Cardiff Bay bubble and there's the Holyrood bubble in Edinburgh as well, and probably there's the Stormont bubble in Belfast, is actually turning people off politics, because you cannot now get decent coverage of an issue that allows people to make up their own mind in an intelligent fashion. Even on the BBC, for example, which is by far the best broadcaster, you don't get complicated issues covered in a sensible way. It's all about personality clashes or splits or some kind of journalistic spin on a story, instead of somebody saying, well, this is what I think about the problem of elderly care. This is what Labour politicians think. This is what Conservative politicians think. Allowing people to make up their own minds about what they think. What you get instead is the argy-bargy in Westminster, which obscures rather than reveals, and you get then a media debate, which is, as I say, all about spin and often invented splits and personalities and who's up and who's down, rather than the big issues of the day explained to people through interviewing politicians. It allows them to put their points of view, and then the viewer or the citizen makes up his or her mind.
Okay, another issue that students were very interested in was the fact that we seem to be going into a situation where the two-party system is breaking down, where we're getting a multi-party system. And the next election could, well, who knows? I mean, the bets are off as to what the result will be. It could be a coalition with one or two parties. It could be some arrangement that's made. And we've had a couple of points raised by students about what sort of coalition a Labour Party would go in and whether coalitions are a real problem when it comes to accountability. Let's listen to what they had to say.
My name's Julian, and given the narrowness of Labour's projected lead in the general election and the rise of the SNP, do you think that a Labour-SNP coalition would be good for Britain?
My name's Eden. The coalition was a first since the post-war era. Do you think the coalition is truly democratic, although no one actually voted for it?
So, Peter, if Utopia is not reached this year in the election and it's not a landslide victory, how would you feel about if there are minority governments now going to coalition? What do you think about coalitions, and how do we make them accountable?
Well, I'm going to be campaigning, as I have been already, hard for a Labour majority, and I think it's achievable, partly because of the way our voting system works, and partly because if the Conservatives couldn't win last time in 2010 against Gordon Brown, who was not a popular Prime Minister, and after the banking crisis, Labour was in power, the global banking crisis, if they couldn't win an outright majority there, I'd be astonished if they're able to win, after all their record of governing, win an outright majority next May. Similarly, for Labour to come back from such a poor result last time to win next time is very difficult, but it's still possible. So that's what I'll be fighting for. Now, as to what happens, I don't think speculation about individual parties is not something I really want to indulge in. I think it will be very, very difficult for the SNP to be accepted into any coalition, given that their objective is to separate Scotland from the rest of us in the UK. Though their policies are closer to Labour's than they are to any other party, probably with the exception of this fundamental elephant in the room of their obsession with separatism and independence, which was rejected, of course, by a pretty clear margin in the referendum. I think you could, if you did have a hung parliament, as the pollsters are predicting and a lot of people are suggesting will happen, you could have so many different outcomes, including, as you imply, Andrea, supply and confidence arrangements, which essentially is that you don't have a formal coalition, but say if Labour was the biggest party, that other parties, including conceivably the Liberal Democrats, who after their experience with the Tories, I don't know that they want to go into coalition with anybody for a while at least, where they would give you support for particular pieces of legislation to be negotiated and support for any attempt on a motion of no confidence. So I think that kind of arrangement is possible, both with us as a Labour Party if we cannot win a majority, and in principle with the Conservatives. The outcome is really, really difficult to predict. I said a year before the last election on the record, and I'm not trying to be clever with hindsight, that it would be a hung parliament. That's what I thought would happen. I think this parliament is really, really difficult to predict. But for the reasons you explain, and the decline in both Labour Party and Conservative Party support compared with when the two-party system was in its heyday, I think it's very difficult for any party to win a majority in the current situation. But politics is very volatile. And it may be that suddenly the electorate decide they want to give us a majority, or conceivably the Conservatives a majority. Who knows?
Yeah. So what politicians think is impossible, because that volatility may well become possible after the election. We'll wait and see. This is the point.
The electorate may will one particular outcome, but they may not get it because it comes back to the point that was made. Our coalition's democratic. Who's actually voted for them? There's nobody standing, like has happened in the past in Germany, on like the CDU, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, stood on a joint ticket. So you knew if you were voting for one of the others, there's a good prospect of a coalition. People, that isn't going to happen for the next election. So the voters could vote for what they want and get something that they'd never dreamt of, which is actually pretty well what happened last time.
Yeah. Well, okay, let's take some of the questions that are coming in now. And don't forget, everyone, that you can send in questions now as Peter is talking. You can also tweet your comments as well on the hashtag #DemocracyGN21. So please do both of that and that will be fine. So what's the first point we have, Andrea?
The first one is from London, Imran Sheikh, and he says a few points. Number one, freedom of speech, what happened in Paris is a disgrace. Currently, freedom of speech is suffering from hypocrisy and double standards. When you have double standards, people lose faith in the system. When a government like Saudi Arabia and Israel are responsible for killing. So the question is, I think, about freedom of speech again. The hypocrisy that surrounds and double standards. Maybe you'd like to answer that. To further that point, maybe also I could add my own comment about the hypocrisy that maybe our British press had in not showing, say, the pictures of the Charlie Hebdo the very next day, which would have surely showed solidarity, I would have thought, for France and for what happened there, but for also the freedom of speech for the press.
Yes, it's riddled with hypocrisy, this whole very, very critical and sensitive question. We've got countries throughout the world which muzzle their press, some of which you've mentioned, have been mentioned in the program, Russia and Saudi Arabia, for instance. We've discussed the restraints and the problems of the British press as well, but we're probably as free a press as many. I think the Scandinavian papers are probably freer than our ones, in the sense that they're more diverse and you don't have so much concentration of ownership. And that's true in other democracies. We don't have a satisfactory situation on the media at all at the present time. The only thing that can be said is that newspaper circulation and therefore the power of the big proprietors is waning. Now, I think that's a danger because I'm a big believer in newspapers, but that's the reality of the modern world. And so that historic headline that when Labour lost under Neil Kinnock in 1992 and the Sun carried on its front page shortly afterwards, it was the Sun what won it. I mean, the Sun's influence, because its circulation has collapsed since then, its influence is much less than it was then. I mean, we're in a much more open situation.
I think what Imran was trying to say as well, though, that there's double standards in the sense that some sections of society, and I guess he's a Muslim, feel more discriminated, less free than other sections of society. You can't make a comment that is considered to be anti-Semitic, but people are often allowed to show cartoons and make comments which people who are Muslims find very, very offensive. And we haven't yet got our act straight yet about how we deal with communities equally.
It's very, very difficult. For example, Jews have historically had to put up with pretty vicious caricatures of faces and their alleged behavior being, conniving, interested only in their own enrichment and that kind of thing, just total anti-Semitic prejudice and caricatures. And Muslims are the victim of that as well. That's why I said at the beginning that standing firm and uncompromising against Islamophobia, which is coming from within our politics, including particularly from UKIP spokespeople and some others in our political parties, and we've got to do that. At the same time, I think the Muslim community has to accept that it is right that their own behavior is put under scrutiny, and including in the media. I mean, it's not acceptable to most people in Britain. It's certainly not acceptable to me, the way that many in the Muslim world treat women. That's just unacceptable. It's not acceptable to many in society, the prejudice within the Muslim community against gay people. And so this is all complex. And I think what matters here is that we respect people's different religions, including Islam, that we respect people's right to practice any religion that they want to, and that's a fundamental right. After all, Jesus and the early Christians fought for that and suffered terribly as a result. And that's got to be upheld. And I personally didn't like the Charlie Hebdo cartoons of Muhammad. I just found them, pretty kind of unedifying and rather offensive. And I totally understand why Muslims find them deeply, deeply offensive. But I equally defend the right of that kind of irreverent anti-clerical journalism, because Charlie Hebdo has been anti-Catholic, anti any religion and anti anybody in the establishment throughout its life. That's the nature of its paper. And it adopts extreme caricatures in cartoons to illustrate that. But I defend their right absolutely to print it. Where I am worried, and this is where I think Imran's question also leads us, I'm a fierce opponent of fascist and racist parties having platforms to spread their poison and their hate, because violence comes from it, and intimidation results, and people who are not white feel imprisoned often in their own houses and unwanted. So I'm a fierce opponent of that, and I'm a fierce opponent of hate crimes, and we have legislation in that. So that kind of freedom of speech is actually restricted. But the right in principle of newspapers to publish irreverent and satirical cartoons, I think it's got to be defended.
Yes, okay. Long live satire. Okay, another question here. We have Alison in Manchester. She says, do we have too many career politicians and not enough community ones? And which would you say you were?
Well, I'm an unusual member of Parliament. Some would say odd member of Parliament, in the sense that my life began in South Africa. In the my parents were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, and that was where I was brought up till I was the age of 16. And they were jailed same time as Nelson Mandela, and they were banned, issued with banning orders, and eventually they stopped my father working, which is how I came as a teenager to Britain with the rest of my family. So I don't really fit either, and I was never a career politician. I then got involved in radical protests, principally through the anti-apartheid struggle, but in campaigning generally for civil rights and for social justice. So I came from an extra-parliamentary background into Parliament, elected as an MP at the age of 41, having in the meantime been a trade union national officer. So I'll leave it to you to judge what I am. I wouldn't be described as a community politician, although I'm a strong believer in street politics and in community engagement, and my record as an MP and beforehand when I was a parliamentary candidate reflects that and proves that. But I am worried that all of our party leaders, and I remain a big admirer, and I'm very close, and he's a very close friend of Ed Miliband, but all our three main party leaders started off having left university as researchers in Parliament, became special advisors in government of one sort or another, and then became MPs, and then became ministers or prime ministers or deputy prime ministers. And I hope Ed Miliband becomes Prime Minister, because I think he'd be very good. But there is a problem of a political career now in a professional sense from a very young age, which never used to be the case. You know, the Tories had estate agents and business people, and they still have some of those. And Labour tended to have postmen and miners and railway workers and lawyers and teachers, a lot of teachers. So you had people who had a different professional experience or trade experience, and I thought that brought a diversity which, you know, the Westminster career pattern just simply doesn't. And that's not people's faults. It doesn't make them better or worse than I am or the past MPs, but it means a parliament that people don't see that's reflecting them to the same extent, though at least in two respects, it got more representative, many more women involved, which is an excellent thing, and more still are needed, and also more members of black and ethnic minorities.
Right. So experience of life is always good in every profession, I think, yes. This kind of leads on from what we're just saying here. Robert in Surrey, he says, how do politicians get out of the Westminster bubble and engage with communities more? So how can we see you out in our streets engaging more?
Well, I like to think I do. Although, you know, we all work very, very long hours, MPs do. In the sense I hold surgeries, I'm available as I'm speaking to you from my Neath constituency office at the present time in South Wales. People can come in to see me and I shop in the streets, I walk around the town and people chat to me the whole time. And I go to events in the constituency where people talk to me, and I welcome that. And, you know, I'm never off duty. I can be going to the pub with my family and somebody will say, can I talk to you about this? And of course, I don't mind that because it's part of my job. So I think MP is actually the best of us, and that's most MPs of all parties these days, actually. You know, the old days when an MP representing a constituency like mine, 200 miles from London, used to live in London and deign to visit the constituency maybe once a month and receive voters. Those days are long gone. Paradoxically, just as we've become more reviled or cynicism about MPs has become greater than ever before, paradoxically, we're probably in closer touch than we used to be, except in one respect. You don't have meetings anymore because people don't come to meetings unless there's a town hall issue or a community issue that they feel threatened by something being built in their area or a big problem. Then they turn up to meetings. That's politics under a different name. But, you know, if I call a meeting to say what Labour's views are in the run-up to the election, the attendance will be tiny, and that goes even more in an area like mine for other parties. So interaction at the level of political debate is much less than it used to be, and that's one of the reasons why parties, whose membership has been shrinking, have become less and less representative of the communities that they purport to represent.
Right, this kind of leads on again, a question from Mina in Croydon. She says, the two-party system was developed in the industrial age. How do you make it fit for the internet age?
Well, I've written about this. I think you've got to do two things. You've got to open up parties more so than just one-way tweets and Facebook interaction and other forms of digital and online communication. I think I led for Ed Miliband in 2010-11 a refounding Labour project, as I called it, to try and reform the party. And one of the things I looked at, which was really interesting, was the way Mumsnet operate. And they have a system whereby their members can send them in digitally their views about whatever is concerning them as mothers. And if it starts trending in the central office, and they have a mechanism of doing that, then they know what is on their members' minds. And often their leaders told me that is the way that they then take things up publicly and with government and get them raised in Parliament and so on. And I think parties have got to start being responsive rather than just one-way digital communication, much more interactive. The other thing I think we've got to do as a Labour Party, and we have made a modest start on this, but nothing like nearly enough, is people are not joiners anymore. They don't join many institutions, actually. The church, trade unions are in the same bracket, but they don't join political parties. I think we should register supporters on a much bigger scale, and I think the party could have potentially hundreds and hundreds of thousands of supporters, maybe millions, that feel they back the party and want to stay in touch digitally, but don't actually want to become members.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I think we've sort of come to the end of those questions now, and all that's been really interesting. But we also have, I mean, you raised the issue of digital engagement, you raised the issue of people not coming to public meetings in the way that they used to. So the idea of debates are not like they used to be, but we had one student who actually made a comment on that, and let's just listen to what he had to say.
Hi, my name's Connor. With last elections, live debate's been a huge success. In your opinion, do you think they should happen again? And if so, do you believe they'll be as successful as they previously were?
I mean, you've raised that point already, but do we have to find new ways of engagement? I mean, you mentioned Mumsnet, but that's almost a public opinion poll in a way. It's not a dialogue. How do we get, in the 21st century, a new form of dialogue going that's interactive? Not just debates, but across the board.
I think, I can't speak for Mumsnet, though I admire them, but I think they would argue that they do have two-way interaction, but I'll just leave that point there. I do think it's important, once having started with television debates, I don't think the Prime Minister should find an excuse to duck out of them, as he clearly is doing, and I hope the broadcasters can find a formula which allows them to go ahead. And three of the party leaders, Ed Miliband, Nick Clegg and Nigel Farage, have written to Cameron to say that they are open to debating with the Greens as well, if that's what the broadcasters determine, but they shouldn't veto a debate. I think it's part of the engagement. Perhaps because they were novel last time and we've never had them, perhaps that's why they got such big viewerships. But I think people are now expected. And I think we need to engage in other ways, digitally as well. And I think it'll happen one way or another. And possibly even by empty chairing David Cameron if he doesn't turn up. I suspect that will happen.
Okay, thanks, Peter. We sort of come to the end now, and we're just going to take a couple of minutes to talk about how we're going to develop and take this on. So thank you for taking part in this, and I mean, it's been really great to do this from your constituency in Neath.
Francis, thank you. Thank you, Andrea, and thank you everybody who's taken part. And I hope that I've been able to answer your questions in a straightforward way. If I didn't answer everybody's points, I apologise for that. But you can always email me at hainp@parliament.uk.
Are you on Twitter?
I am on Twitter, yes,
yeah.
Peter Hain.
Or even send you a note through Mumsnet. Andrea.
Well, the future and health of our democracy is going to feature significantly in the next few years, particularly obviously because this is an election year in the UK. So we do hope to do quite a few events around the 21st century democracy at a national, global and international level. We hope to look at the basic principles of democracy and how it affects those different levels. We spoke to Sarah Allen of the organisation Involve about the need for some basic principles. Let's listen to what Sarah had to say.
And they often get mixed up, and that's not very helpful. So on the one hand, you've got debates that start from theories of democracy and democratic values and assess how our institutions could be improved against them, and that's what you might call the classic constitutional reform agenda. But I think there's another debate, which is what I'm interested in, which is slightly different from that, which is about how you get more people and a greater diversity of people to engage with the political system and have an influence over political decisions. And I think when you're looking at that, you need to start from where people are at, what their cultural norms are, what channels they use, how to make engagement attractive to them. And I think we often don't start debates about that issue in that way, and I think that we should.
Okay, I think we may have just got the beginning of that clipped off a little, but I think what Sarah was saying is that democracy is not just about constitutional democracy, it's also about engagement at a local level. And we're carrying this further. For example, Sarah is going to do a webinar with us on February the 5th. And that webinar will look at engagement at a local level, how people can get engaged, because democracy is not just about voting, it's about actually action and engagement. And so she's going to look at some of the skills of that and how people can coherently develop an action plan in order to make a difference in their areas through democratic engagement. You can join that on February the 5th by going to our meetup site, which you'll find on www.meetup.com/globalnet21. That's www.meetup.com/globalnet21. So join us there, and we will also be having a lot of other events, we hope, in the year, and plan some interesting things during the general election period as well. So thank you all for taking part.
And also you can carry on this discussion if you wish with our Twitter feed, which is #DemocracyGN21. That's #DemocracyGN21. All that remains for us to do is to say thank you very much. There was a lot of questions that came through, so sorry if we didn't get around to yours, but please do keep sending them through and do keep the debate going. That is what freedom of speech and democracy, after all, is all about. So thank you from me, Andrea Gordon, and see you soon.
And thank you from me, and thank you all of you for joining us.
Bye-bye.